The courtroom was a sea of tension as the judge entered with his usual air of authority, his black robes flowing behind him as he took his seat at the high bench. A silence fell over the room as everyone stood to attention, the air thick with anticipation. The defendant, a black woman, stood before the court. Her name was Brianna Carter. Her eyes were steady, her posture perfect. She wore a sharp navy blue suit that contrasted against the harsh lighting of the courtroom. She wasn't just anyone standing trial. She was a figure of quiet power, a woman who had seen the inner workings of the legal system and knew how to navigate it. She stood there composed, her hands folded in front of her, while her lawyer, a seasoned attorney named Marcus Reed, whispered a few words of reassurance in her ear. Brianna nodded slightly, and her focus remained unwavering on the judge. At the center of the room was Judge Harold Pierce, known for his strict rulings and unyielding demeanor. A man who had built a reputation for his sharp tongue and quick decisions. His courtroom had a history of harsh sentences that reflected his tough stance on crime. The case against Brianna seemed clear enough on the surface. She was accused of financial crimes that many believed were tied to a series of mismanagements in a government-funded housing project. Brianna was accused of embezzling funds from the project, though there was little evidence to prove she had done so. It was a case that seemed to be based on assumptions rather than facts, and Brianna knew it. Judge Pierce began the proceedings with his usual no-nonsense approach, his voice booming across the room as he addressed the charges with confidence. There was no room for doubt in his words as he outlined the nature of the case and the allegations against Brianna, but Brianna wasn't shaken by the severity of the accusations or the judge's stern expression. Her calm gaze never wavered as the judge continued to speak. She had heard it all before, lawyers accusing her of things she hadn't done, systems failing to protect the innocent. She had become used to being underestimated in her life, but she had never backed down, and today wouldn't be any different. Her lawyer, Marcus, stood up and began his defense, arguing that the charges were based on flimsy evidence and that there had been a number of procedural errors during the investigation. He pointed out that Brianna had always acted within the bounds of the law and had been a victim of a system that often turned a blind eye to the truth. But Judge Pierce wasn't interested in his arguments. He was already dismissing them with a wave of his hand as he sat back in his chair, his gavel striking with sharp precision. He was eager to move on with the trial and get to the verdict. Brianna's case wasn't the one he wanted to waste time on today. He had more important things to do. But Brianna knew something the judge didn't. She had been watching him for months, tracking his decisions, scrutinizing his every move. From the moment she stepped into this courtroom, she had a plan, one that would force him to reckon with his own biases and flaws. She knew the system was corrupt, but today she was going to make sure everyone else saw it too. As the trial progressed, Judge Pierce grew more impatient with each passing moment, his sharp eyes fixed on Brianna and her lawyer as they presented their arguments and evidence. But he wasn't listening anymore. His mind was already made up in his world. There was no room for nuance, no space for second chances. He was convinced that Brianna was guilty, and he was determined to make her pay for what he saw as an attempt to manipulate the system. Marcus Reed continued to defend his client with all the passion he could muster, but the judge's dismissive gestures and cold stares only made it more difficult. The defense's arguments bounced off the judge's hard exterior like water off a stone. Every attempt to sway him fell flat. Brianna remained silent throughout, the back and forth, her eyes never leaving the judge, her face an impassive mask of calm. But beneath the surface, there was a storm brewing. She could feel the injustice in every word the judge spoke, every ruling he made. It was a system she knew all too well, one that rewarded the powerful and ignored the truth. The prosecutor stood up next, presenting the evidence against Brianna with a fervor that matched the judge's intensity. The prosecution's case was strong on paper, but it was built on assumptions and circumstantial evidence. There was no concrete proof that Brianna had done anything wrong, but the judge didn't care. He was already locked in on his decision. He was so sure of her guilt that he didn't even bother to consider the possibility of error. As the prosecutor spoke, Judge Pierce nodded approvingly, as if every word confirmed his suspicions. The defendant was guilty, and it was only a matter of time before the verdict was read. Brianna knew this was coming. She had been preparing for this moment for months. Everything had been leading up to this point. She had studied every ruling the judge had made over the years, and she had found patterns of favoritism, bias, and even corruption. She had seen how the judge had treated people who looked like her, how he had dismissed their cases with little regard for fairness. She had witnessed firsthand the way the system favored the wealthy and punished the poor. She had been collecting evidence, meticulously building a case against the very man sitting in front of her, the man who believed he held all the power in the room. But Brianna wasn't just here to clear her name, she was here to expose the truth. When the judge finally turned to her and asked for her statement, she took a deep breath, her voice calm. but unwavering as she addressed the court, her words cutting through the tension in the room. She spoke not just of her innocence, but of the larger issues at play, the way the system was broken, the way it had been designed to favor the powerful and oppress the vulnerable. Her words were a challenge, a call to action. She wasn't just defending herself, she was demanding change. Judge Pierce stared at her incredulously, his face reddening with anger. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How dare this woman speak to him this way? How dare she challenge his authority? But Brianna wasn't finished. She knew the truth was too important to be silenced. She had one more thing to say, and this time the entire room would listen. Brianna stood tall, her voice steady. As she continued speaking, she could feel the weight of every word as she addressed not only the judge but everyone in the room. They needed to hear this. They needed to understand that this wasn't just about her case, it was about the very foundation of the system they had all been part of. She wasn't here to beg for mercy or apologize for a crime she didn't commit. She was here to demand justice for everyone who had been silenced by the very people who were supposed to protect them. Judge Pierce shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes narrowed as he watched her speak, his face flushed with a mix of confusion and irritation. He had seen many defendants before, but none like this, none who dared challenge him with such conviction. Brianna wasn't just defending herself, she was calling out everything he had stood for, everything he had done in his career as a judge. And for the first time he was unsure of how to respond. His power had been questioned, and he wasn't used to feeling vulnerable. She went on detailing the ways in which the legal system had failed her and countless others. She spoke of the hidden biases that had led to her wrongful charges, the systemic flaws that allowed corruption to flourish. She didn't just speak for herself, she spoke for those who had been unjustly punished, for those who had been forgotten by the law. She talked about how the court had treated her based on the color of her skin, how the wealthy and powerful were able to bend the rules while people like her were left to suffer under their weight. Her words rang out in the quiet room, and with every sentence she could see the judge growing more and more uncomfortable. The courtroom was still, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. As Brianna finished her statement, she took a deep breath and then said the words that would change everything she had known from the start, that the judge wasn't simply a bystander in her case. She had come to this courtroom prepared for much more than a trial. She had been monitoring the judge for months, watching his every move, tracking his decisions, and documenting every instance where his bias had influenced his rulings. At first, the judge tried to dismiss her words as nothing more than a feeble defense tactic, but Brianna didn't back down. She pulled out a stack of documents and laid them on the table in front of her. She didn't look at the judge. Instead, she turned to the prosecutor and the jury, showing them the damning evidence that had been carefully collected. She had proof of the judge's involvement in cases where personal gain had clouded his judgment. She had evidence of preferential treatment given to certain defendants who had paid his court fees for private matters. She had recorded conversations where the judge had openly expressed his disdain for lower-income individuals like her, and most shockingly, she had records showing how the judge had manipulated certain verdicts to protect his own interests. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as everyone realized what Brianna had just revealed. They couldn't believe it. The respected Judge Pierce, who had been the cornerstone of this court for years, was now the subject of a corruption investigation. As Brianna looked around the room, she could see the shock on everyone's face. Even the prosecutor was speechless. For the first time in the trial, Judge Pierce was silent, his face pale, his hands trembling as he tried to process what was happening to him. Brianna watched him carefully, her expression never changing. She knew that the moment of truth had arrived, and there was no turning back now. The game had shifted. The balance of power was no longer in the hands of the judge, it was in hers. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as Judge Pierce stared at the pile of evidence laid out in front of him, his face drained of color, his mind racing. He had been exposed in a way he never thought possible. For a moment, he could only sit there frozen, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief, trying to form words, but none came out. Brianna stood before him, calm and unwavering, her eyes locked onto his. She could feel the power shifting. The court was no longer on his side, it was hers now. The room was alive with whispers. People began turning to each other, trying to process what had just unfolded. Some were in disbelief, while others seemed to come to the same shocking conclusion, that the man they had trusted for years was the one who had betrayed them. Brianna's evidence was irrefutable, and the judge knew it. His entire career was now under a microscope. Every decision he had ever made was tainted by the corruption she had uncovered, but despite everything, he refused to admit defeat. Instead, he tried to reassert control, his voice shaking as he spoke. He demanded that the evidence be dismissed as false. He tried to argue that Brianna was fabricating the entire case, but no one was listening to him anymore. The room had already made up its mind. The prosecutor finally found his voice as he stood up from his seat. His tone was no longer one of support for the judge, but of shock and disbelief. He slowly addressed the court, acknowledging that the evidence presented by Brianna was beyond questioning. He expressed his concern about the integrity of the entire trial and how the actions of Judge Pierce had now cast a shadow over the entire legal system. Brianna's lawyer, Marcus, nodded in agreement. He too could barely hide his surprise, but his professionalism prevailed as he turned toward the judge with a look of quiet satisfaction. Brianna's plan had worked beyond their expectations. Judge Pierce's expression twisted with anger as he tried to hold onto whatever shred of authority he had left. His eyes darted around the room looking for support, but there was none. His grip on the gavel tightened as if it could restore the power he had lost, but the symbol of his position was no longer enough to intimidate anyone. The courtroom was no longer under his command. Brianna had taken that from him, and now the truth was all that mattered. Brianna took a step forward. She was not finished yet. The evidence she had presented was only the beginning. She had one more thing to say, one more piece of the puzzle to put into place. She turned to the jury and the people in the gallery, her voice steady as she spoke to them directly. She reminded them of the purpose of the court: to seek justice, to uncover the truth, and hold those in power accountable. She told them that her actions today were not just about exposing a single judge's corruption. It was about changing the system so that it could no longer protect those who abused their power. Her words hung in the air as the crowd grew quiet. The magnitude of what she had just done began to sink in. Judge Pierce had not only been caught, but his actions had now opened the door for a larger conversation about reform, about fairness, and the need for accountability in the justice system. Brianna had set something in motion that could not be undone, and the question now was how far the ripples of her actions would go. The judge sat slumped in his chair, his earlier bravado replaced with defeat. His once imposing presence now seemed small and insignificant in the face of Brianna's strength. He had underestimated her, and now the consequences of his arrogance were clear to everyone in the room. Brianna stood there in the stillness of the courtroom, her gaze unwavering as Judge Pierce sat in stunned silence, his shoulders hunched in defeat, his earlier arrogance now completely gone, the weight of his own failure pressing down on him. He had been too sure of his power, too confident in his ability to control the room, but now it was clear to everyone that Brianna was the one who had outsmarted him. She had orchestrated this moment with precision, and he had walked right into it. The courtroom was buzzing with disbelief. Murmurs of shock and awe rippled through the gallery as people turned to each other, exchanging looks of surprise. Some were still processing what had just happened, while others were eager to see what would come next. Brianna's lawyer, Marcus Reed, stood beside her, his expression a mix of pride and caution. He knew this moment was monumental, but there was still much more at stake. The judge's career was now on the line, and the consequences of his actions could go far beyond this courtroom. The prosecutor, who had been so eager to present a case against Brianna, now found himself in an uncomfortable position. He had once stood behind Judge Pierce, but now he had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. The evidence presented by Brianna was undeniable, and there was no turning back from the reality she had exposed. For a moment, he simply stared at the judge, as if waiting for him to offer some defense. But none came. Judge Pierce remained silent, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to collect himself, but the damage had already been done. Brianna's eyes flickered to the judge one last time. She could feel the weight of his gaze, but she didn't flinch. She knew what she had done was bigger than herself, bigger than the case at hand. It was about justice. It was about the countless people who had been silenced by a corrupt system. And she wasn't going to let that go unnoticed, not anymore, not when she had the chance to make a real change. She turned her attention back to the room, and her voice rang out clear and firm, addressing everyone present. She reminded them that the fight wasn't over just because one judge had been exposed. There were more cases to be uncovered, more people in power who had abused their positions. She urged the jury and the witnesses to take a stand and demand accountability, not just in this trial, but in every trial, every decision made within the walls of the court. She spoke of reform. She spoke of a justice system that truly served the people, not just the elite or the powerful. Her words echoed through the courtroom like a rallying cry, and for the first time in this trial, people were beginning to see the bigger picture. They weren't just watching a case, they were witnessing a movement. The cracks in the system had been exposed, and Brianna was leading the charge to heal them. Judge Pierce could feel the walls closing in around him as the realization hit him hard. This was no longer just about his career, it was about his legacy and the future of his profession. All of his years of judgment, his decisions that had shaped so many lives, were now being called into question. He had never imagined that his own actions would be the catalyst for this moment, and now he was left with nothing but the consequences of his arrogance. As Brianna finished speaking, she stood tall, her posture strong, her purpose clear, and for the first time in the courtroom, the people who had once viewed her as just another defendant saw her as something more. They saw her as a force to be reckoned with, and they knew that whatever happened next, Brianna Carter would not be silenced again. Brianna stood there watching the room slowly process everything that had just happened. Her words still hung in the air like a call to arms as the crowd shifted in their seats. Some looked uneasy, others were nodding in agreement. Her gaze swept across the courtroom once more before she turned her attention back to Judge Pierce. He had slumped further in his chair, his earlier attempts at maintaining control long gone. The once confident judge now seemed small and fragile, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly as they gripped the edge of the desk. His mind was clearly racing, but Brianna knew it was too late for him to escape the reality of the situation. As the silence stretched on, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on Judge Pierce with every passing second. Brianna could see the fear creeping into his eyes, but he refused to speak. He refused to acknowledge the truth of what had been uncovered. Even as the weight of his own guilt bore down on him, the people in the room were starting to see it too. The man who had once held so much power was now exposed for what he truly was, a man who had used his position to manipulate the system for his own gain and protect those who could afford to keep him on their side. The prosecutor stood up at last, his face red with frustration and disbelief. He cleared his throat before addressing the court, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. He began by acknowledging the evidence that Brianna had presented, and then he turned his attention to Judge Pierce, his words cutting through the air like a knife, his tone laced with a mixture of anger and disbelief. How could he have been so blind? How could he have failed to see what was happening under his very nose? But as the prosecutor spoke, Brianna could see that the shift in power was complete. The courtroom had already made up its mind. The case had taken on a life of its own. Marcus Reed turned to Brianna with a proud smile on his face as he whispered quietly to her, "You did it. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about all of us." Brianna smiled back at him, but her mind was already racing ahead. She had known all along that this wasn't just a personal fight for her. It had never been about clearing her name. It was about dismantling a broken system. And today she had taken the first step toward making that happen. She had exposed the rot that ran deep within the walls of the court, but this was just the beginning. Brianna had prepared for this moment for months. She had spent countless hours researching the judge's decisions, tracking his biases, collecting evidence that no one else had bothered to look for, and now she could feel the weight of her work paying off. The people in the room were no longer seeing her as a mere defendant. They were seeing her as a leader, a woman who had exposed the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. But even as the judge remained silent, Brianna knew that the battle was far from over. She had done her part. But the fight for true justice would require more than just exposing one corrupt judge. It would require the collective efforts of those who were willing to stand up and demand change, and Brianna was ready for whatever came next. She knew that her role in this fight was just beginning, and no matter what happened in the coming days, she would not back down. She would keep pushing for accountability. She would keep pushing for reform. And she would not stop until the system was forced to reckon with the truth. As the prosecutor continued his statements, Brianna stood firm at her place beside her lawyer, a sense of quiet confidence settling in her chest. She had done more than she had ever dreamed possible, and now it was time for the world to see what could happen when the truth finally came to light. The courtroom was alive with hushed whispers as the reality of what had just unfolded began to sink in. Brianna could feel the weight of the room's attention pressing down on her, but she remained calm, her posture unwavering, her mind focused on what needed to happen next. Judge Pierce still hadn't spoken, and the silence from the bench seemed to grow more oppressive with each passing moment. The prosecutor had been speaking for several minutes, but his words no longer had the same weight as they once did now. They were simply an echo of the larger truth that Brianna had already exposed. The system was broken, and Judge Pierce was the one who had been its most glaring example. The jury sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Brianna and the judge, unsure of what to make of the scene that was unfolding before them. They had come into the trial expecting a routine case, a clear-cut decision, but now they were caught in the middle of something far bigger, something that none of them could have anticipated. Brianna could see the doubt creeping into their expressions, the uncertainty as they realized that the very man who was supposed to preside over justice was the one who had been manipulating the system for his own gain. Brianna turned her attention back to the judge, his hands still trembling as they gripped the sides of the bench, his gaze fixed downward, as if he could somehow will himself out of the situation he was in. But Brianna knew better. She knew that no amount of pretending could save him now. She had forced his hand, and now the consequences of his actions were clear to everyone in the room. His arrogance, his corruption had finally caught up with him, and there was no escape. The prosecutor's words trailed off as the gravity of the situation took hold of the room. A collective realization seemed to sweep through the gallery. People began shifting in their seats, some glancing around nervously, others leaning forward eager to see what would happen next. Brianna could feel their eyes on her. She knew that this moment was bigger than her own case. It was bigger than the judge. It was a turning point in the way justice would be viewed by everyone present. After a long pause, Marcus Reed stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension as he addressed the court. Brianna's case was not just a matter of proving her innocence, it was a matter of reform. He said, his words deliberate and measured. The system that had allowed this to happen was flawed, and it was time for a change. It was time to dismantle the structures that perpetuated this kind of corruption and ensure that no one would be able to abuse the system like Judge Pierce had done. Brianna had exposed the ugly truth, and now it was time for everyone to look at the full picture. The room was still as the prosecutor nodded in agreement with Marcus' statement, his eyes briefly meeting Brianna's. For the first time since the trial had started, there was a shared understanding between them, a realization that this moment would go far beyond the courtroom and would reverberate through the halls of power. The ripple effect would be felt far and wide, and Brianna had just become the catalyst for change. The judge finally stirred as if waking from a trance, his face red with shame, his eyes darting around the room, looking for any sign of support. But no one was willing to help him now. The damning evidence was there for all to see, and it had only taken one woman to expose it. Brianna's heart raced as she watched him squirm, but she held her ground. She had done what she came here to do, and now it was time to let the chips fall where they may. As the judge opened his mouth to speak for the first time, his voice came out strained and unsteady. He tried to regain control of the room, but it was too late. The damage was done, and Brianna knew that no matter what came next, the course of justice had been set in motion, and it was only a matter of time before the world would see the truth. Judge Pierce's voice cracked as he attempted to speak, but the words seemed to get lost in his throat. His eyes flickered around the room, desperately seeking someone to offer him support. But no one moved. Brianna could see his desperation, but she felt no sympathy. This was the moment where he could no longer hide behind the facade of power he had so carefully crafted for years. Brianna had exposed him, and now there was no turning back. She watched as his hands shook as he tried to gather his thoughts, but the courtroom was no longer his to control. The prosecutor was the first to react to the judge's faltering words, his voice steady and cutting. As he addressed the court, he reminded everyone of the evidence that had been presented, the undeniable proof of corruption that had been exposed, and he questioned how this could have gone on for so long. How many people had been harmed by the judge's decisions? How many lives had been affected by the biases and personal interests that had influenced his rulings? Brianna's lawyer, Marcus, nodded along with the prosecutor, his face a mask of determination as he stood firm beside his client. There was no longer any doubt in anyone's mind that this was no ordinary trial and Judge Pierce was no ordinary judge. Brianna felt a surge of strength course through her as the prosecutor continued to speak, his words reinforcing everything she had worked for. She had known from the beginning that the odds were stacked against her, but she had prepared herself for this moment, and now that it had arrived, she was ready for whatever came next. As the prosecutor finished speaking, he turned his attention back to the judge, his eyes cold with accusation. Judge Pierce finally found his voice, his words low and strained as he tried to mount some defense, but his arguments were weak and lacked conviction. He could not explain away the mountain of evidence that Brianna had presented. He could not deny the patterns of bias and corruption that had been uncovered by the careful research and diligence of the woman he had tried to dismiss as just another defendant in his courtroom. Brianna watched him with unwavering intensity, her gaze fixed on him as if daring him to say something that might change the course of this moment, but deep down she knew it was already too late for him. The judge's attempts at defending himself faltered as the courtroom began to take on a new energy. Brianna had shifted the tide in her favor, and now the people in the room were beginning to realize the extent of what had been revealed. It was no longer just about her innocence, it was about the system that had allowed this corruption to go unchecked for so long, the system that had failed so many people like her who had been caught in its web and then left to suffer without recourse. Brianna had taken the first step in exposing the truth, but she knew this was only the beginning. The jury watched carefully, their faces a mixture of shock and contemplation as the weight of the judge's actions became clear to them. Brianna had laid bare the inner workings of a system that was designed to protect the powerful and punish the vulnerable. The judge had been the embodiment of everything that was wrong with that system, and now his career was crumbling before their eyes. Brianna could see the shift in their expressions as they absorbed everything that had just unfolded. They were beginning to understand the significance of her actions and the implications it would have not just for this case, but for the future of the justice system itself. As the room fell into another silence, Brianna knew that the next step was imminent. The judge's fate was in the hands of those who had witnessed his downfall, but Brianna had already won her battle. Her purpose had been fulfilled. She had exposed the truth, and no matter what came next, the truth was now out there, and it was no longer possible for anyone to ignore it. The silence in the courtroom was thick as the weight of what had just transpired settled over everyone. Brianna could feel the eyes of the jury upon her, their gaze filled with a mixture of disbelief and respect. They had seen the evidence, they had heard the prosecutor and her lawyer speak, but now they were left to process the enormity of what had just been revealed. Judge Pierce's career was over. There was no denying it anymore, and yet Brianna knew this was not just a personal victory for her. This was a turning point for the entire system. The corruption that had been hiding in plain sight was now exposed, and the world would not be able to ignore it. Brianna felt a strange sense of calm wash over her as she stood there in the center of the room. She had been prepared for this moment for so long, but now that it had arrived, it was almost surreal. She glanced over at her lawyer, Marcus, who had a proud but quiet expression on his face. He had believed in her from the start, and now his faith had been rewarded. Brianna couldn't help but feel grateful for his support. Without him, none of this would have been possible. The judge still sat there, his face pale and his hands trembling as if he had aged a decade. In a matter of minutes, his earlier bluster was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost defeated demeanor. Brianna had never seen him this way before. It was as if the man who had once commanded such authority was nothing more than a shell of his former self. She almost felt a pang of sympathy for him, but then she remembered everything he had done, all the lives he had ruined in his pursuit of power and wealth, and any sympathy she might have had vanished like smoke. The prosecutor began speaking again, his voice filled with finality as he turned toward the jury and spoke of the grave consequences of what had happened today. He explained the importance of their decision and how it would affect not just this case, but the broader fight for justice. The judge's actions had been a breach of trust, a betrayal of the very principles that the court was supposed to uphold. He asked the jury to consider not just the evidence before them, but the larger implications of their decision, and to recognize the significance of what Brianna had done by exposing the judge's corruption. As the prosecutor finished his remarks, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the jury to deliberate. But before they could start their process, Brianna felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation building inside her. This was the moment she had dreamed of, but it was also the moment when everything she had fought for could either succeed or fail. The system was on the brink of collapse, and the outcome of this trial would set the stage for what would happen next. The jury filed out of the courtroom, and Brianna remained standing at her place, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. She had done everything she could to make this moment possible, but now she had to wait. Now the fate of the case was out of her hands. Outside the courtroom, reporters were already gathering, eager to hear from both sides of the trial. They knew that whatever happened next would make headlines. Brianna could already hear their questions echoing in her mind, but for now, she focused on the task at hand. She had exposed the truth, but what would happen to Judge Pierce? What would happen to the system now that its flaws had been exposed? Would anyone take action, or would it all be swept under the rug as so many things had been before? As the minutes ticked by, Brianna's thoughts raced, but she knew there was nothing left to do but wait. Now the world was watching, and the truth was finally out in the open. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Brianna stood in the courtroom waiting for the jury's decision. The silence was unbearable, yet strangely calming. She had already done what she set out to do, but the weight of the moment was still there, pressing down on her chest. There was no turning back now, no undoing the truth. She had exposed. The question that remained was what the jury would decide and how the court would respond to the actions she had revealed. Outside the courtroom, Brianna could hear the murmurs of the reporters as they prepared for what they assumed would be a quick verdict. The world was eager to know how the trial would unfold. They had seen the evidence, they had heard the prosecutor speak, and they had witnessed the judge's unraveling, but now the question was whether the system that had protected him for so long would finally hold him accountable, or would it once again fail to deliver justice. Brianna's lawyer, Marcus, stood beside her, his eyes sharp, but filled with a quiet kind of anticipation. He had been confident in their case from the beginning, but he knew better than to make assumptions about how the jury would respond. He had seen too many cases where the truth was buried under layers of influence and power to take anything for granted. His calm demeanor belied the intensity of the situation. Brianna could feel his presence next to her, and though he said little, she could sense the support and the understanding between them. The judge was still in his chair, his face pale and eyes glazed over. He had not moved since Brianna had exposed him. He seemed to be locked in place, as if waiting for something to give him an escape or a reason to deny what had already been laid bare for everyone to see. But there was no escape for him this time, no words he could offer to shift the focus back onto the case or onto Brianna's guilt. She had taken the power from him in a way that could not be undone. Finally, the door to the jury room opened, and the jurors filed back into the courtroom, their faces unreadable, but their eyes betraying the weight of the decision they had just made. Brianna's heart raced as they took their seats. She glanced over at Marcus, who gave her a reassuring nod. He could sense her tension, but he knew that what was coming next would be the culmination of all their hard work. The foreman of the jury stood and addressed the court, his voice steady but filled with the gravity of the moment. The courtroom fell silent again. As he began to speak, Brianna held her breath, waiting for the words that would determine everything. For the past few months, she had fought with everything she had to bring the truth to light, and now she would find out if it had been enough. The foreman's voice echoed through the room as he read aloud the jury's verdict. Guilty. Brianna's heart skipped a beat as the word landed. The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment before the murmurs began. The weight of the decision was like a release, a final reckoning for the judge who had abused his power for far too long. The gavel struck as the judge tried to maintain some semblance of order, but it was clear to everyone that the power had shifted. The courtroom no longer belonged to him. It now belonged to the truth that Brianna had fought for and exposed. Judge Pierce sat frozen, unable to comprehend the finality of the verdict. His head hung low, as if the weight of his guilt had become too much to bear. Brianna allowed herself a moment to feel the rush of victory. She had done it not just for herself, but for everyone who had suffered under a system that had allowed this kind of corruption to flourish. It was a win, not just for justice, but for the people who had been waiting for someone to stand up to the injustice that had long been accepted as normal. Her fight had been long, but it had not been in vain. Brianna had exposed the truth, and now the world would have to reckon with it. The courtroom was still buzzing with energy as the verdict settled in the air. The words guilty echoed through Brianna's mind, and for a moment everything felt surreal, as if she were caught in a dream. But the reality of the situation hit her in waves. The judge who had once held all the power in this room had now been stripped of it. His career was over, and his actions would no longer go unnoticed. Brianna stood tall, her heart racing, but her resolve unshaken. She had done what she came here to do, and now it was time to see the consequences unfold. Outside the courtroom, reporters were scrambling to gather information. The news had already spread like wildfire. Judge Pierce's downfall was all over the headlines, and Brianna was at the center of it all. The woman who had taken down a corrupt judge and exposed the broken system for everyone to see. But Brianna wasn't focused on the cameras or the flashing lights. She was focused on the moment that had just passed. She had fought for justice, and now the world was beginning to take notice. As the judge remained seated, his hands still trembling, the courtroom slowly began to clear. The air was thick with tension, but also with a sense of relief. Brianna's victory was not just a personal one, it was a victory for all those who had been wronged by the system and the corruption that had flourished within it. As she stood there with Marcus by her side, she couldn't help but think of all the people who had been part of this journey, the ones who had supported her from the beginning, the ones who had believed in her when no one else would, the ones who had given her the strength to keep fighting when the odds were stacked against her. As the last of the spectators filed out of the room, Brianna turned to Marcus, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "Thank you for everything," she said. Marcus smiled at her, his eyes proud. "You did it," he replied. "You took down a giant." But Brianna knew it wasn't just about taking down one man, it was about something bigger. It was about challenging the system that had allowed corruption to thrive unchecked. It was about showing the world that one person could make a difference, that one voice could expose the truth and demand accountability. She had done that today, and the ripple effect of her actions would continue long after the trial had ended. As they left the courtroom and stepped into the chaos of the media frenzy, Brianna could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. But it was a weight she welcomed. She had fought for justice, and now she was ready to continue that fight for as long as it took. She knew this was just the beginning. There were more cases to expose, more injustices to confront, and more people to hold accountable. But Brianna was no longer the same person who had walked into that courtroom months ago. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she had the courage to stand up for what was right. The reporters surrounded her, asking questions, snapping photos, but Brianna stood firm and answered them with conviction. She spoke of the importance of transparency, the need for reform, and the role that the public played in holding their leaders accountable. It was clear to her now that the change she had started in that courtroom had the power to spread far beyond the walls of the justice system. It was a movement that could inspire others to take a stand and demand a better future. As the media frenzy continued, Brianna allowed herself a moment to reflect on how far she had come. She thought of the people who had doubted her at the beginning, the ones who had believed she didn't stand a chance, but now they would see what was possible when one person had the courage to take on the system and fight for the truth. She smiled to herself. This was her victory, but it was also a victory for everyone who had been overlooked by the system, for everyone who had ever been told that their voices didn't matter. Now they would know that they did, and Brianna Carter would be the one to show them the way. The world outside the courtroom was a blur of flashing cameras and loud voices, but Brianna's mind was clear as she made her way through the throngs of reporters. She had fought for so long to expose the truth, and now that the battle was won, she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose rise within her. There was no turning back now. The fight had just begun. In a way, it wasn't just about Judge Pierce anymore. It was about something far larger, something that reached beyond the walls of this courthouse and touched every corner of the justice system itself. The corruption she had exposed was only one example of a broken system that had failed so many, and Brianna knew that the change she had sparked today was only the first step toward rebuilding it. As she made her way to the car, the reporters followed her, their questions coming fast and furious, but Brianna didn't let the chaos around her shake her. She had a message, and she wasn't going to let anything distract her from it. Her voice steady and unwavering, she spoke about the need for transparency and reform in the legal system. She spoke of accountability and justice for those who had been wronged. She spoke for the people who had been silenced for too long. And she vowed that this wouldn't be the last time she stood up for what was right. The public was finally listening, and Brianna was determined to make them understand that this was just the beginning. Inside the car, Marcus looked at her with a smile, his eyes filled with pride. Brianna could see the recognition in his gaze, the understanding that this was more than just a legal victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been subjected to the biases and injustices of the court system. It was a turning point that would go down in history as the moment when one woman had the courage to expose the truth and take down a corrupt system. As the car drove away from the courthouse, Brianna felt a sense of calm settle over her. She knew there was much work ahead, but for the first time in a long time she felt confident that change was possible, that the system could be fixed, that justice could be served. And as the city passed by her window, she allowed herself to imagine the future, the one where the voices of the people were heard, and the powerful no longer held all the cards. She had become the symbol of that future, and she was ready to fight for it with everything she had. In the days that followed, Brianna's name became known to millions of people across the country and around the world. But she didn't let the fame distract her from her mission. She used her newfound platform to continue speaking out against corruption and inequality. She met with lawmakers, activists, and community leaders who shared her vision of a more just and equitable society. Together, they began to push for the reforms that Brianna had always known were necessary to root out the corruption that had poisoned the justice system for so long. Judge Pierce's conviction was just the beginning of a larger movement, one that would take years of work and dedication to achieve. But Brianna was ready for it. She knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but she also knew that with each step she took, more and more people would join her, and together they would create a system where truth and justice prevailed, where no one was above the law, and where the voices of the oppressed were no longer ignored. As Brianna looked ahead at the future, she couldn't help but smile. The fight was far from over, but she had already proven what was possible when someone had the courage to stand up and speak the truth. And no matter what came next, she would continue that fight with unwavering resolve, because Brianna Carter knew that change was possible, and she would be the one to make it happen. Brianna stood in the shadow of the courthouse, her eyes reflecting the bustling energy of the city around her, her heart still racing from the whirlwind of the trial. Her name was on everyone's lips now, the cameras, the reporters, the whispers in the street, all focused on her. But Brianna didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who had just opened a door to a world full of possibilities, one that had been locked away for far too long. What she had done in that courtroom wasn't just about winning a case, it was about something much larger, something that was only beginning to unfold. The conviction of Judge Pierce was monumental, but Brianna knew it was only a small piece of the puzzle. The system that had allowed his corruption to flourish was still very much in place, and there were many more like him lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. Brianna had exposed the cracks in the foundation, but now it was time to tear the whole thing down and rebuild it from the ground up. As the days passed, Brianna became more and more determined to see her vision through. She didn't let the fame get to her head, or the pressure of public opinion sway her resolve. Instead, she used her platform to speak about the systemic issues that had allowed corruption to thrive for so long. She met with activists and leaders who shared her passion for justice. Together, They began to craft a plan for reform, one that would address the root causes of the problems she had uncovered in that courtroom. It wasn't easy. The road to change was always going to be long and filled with opposition, but Brianna didn't back down. She had learned that the truth had a way of shaking things up. And the more people who knew the truth, the harder it became to ignore it. She traveled across the country speaking at rallies and town halls. She sat down with lawmakers and judges. She met with those who had been affected by the very system she was trying to change. And with every conversation, every meeting, she felt the weight of her responsibility grow. But so did her hope that change was possible. One evening after a long day of meetings, Brianna sat alone in her office staring at the stacks of paperwork on her desk. She was exhausted, but there was a fire in her chest that kept her going. She thought back to that day in the courtroom when everything had shifted, when she had exposed the corruption for all to see. And she realized that in that moment she had not just defeated Judge Pierce, she had taken down the system that had protected him for so long. She had shown the world that one person could make a difference. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she picked it up to find a message from Marcus. He was checking in as he always did, his message simple but full of encouragement. "You're changing the world, Brianna. Keep pushing. Don't stop." Brianna smiled as she read the message, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe. She had taken the first step. But there was still so much to do. She had to keep pushing for change, for accountability, for justice. The work was far from over, but Brianna was ready for whatever came next. She stood up from her desk, walked to the window, and looked out at the city below. The streets were alive with movement, people walking, talking, living their lives, unaware of the battle that had been fought and won in the courtroom. But Brianna knew that everything had changed, and no matter how long it took, she would continue to fight for the world. She believed in a world where truth and justice were not just ideals but reality, where corruption could no longer hide in the shadows, and where the voices of the people were finally heard. And with that thought, Brianna knew that she would never stop fighting.